Yeah. English. Haha. That's the problem with the break at a conference in Germany when you talk to people in German and English, so that you forget which language you should use. So, hi. Welcome to the PHP Stacks supply chain. And my name is Sebastian. I have a couple of years of experience being a Sebastian. And I started doing things with computers in 1990. I learned programming on an Amiga 500 and an Amiga 1200 in C and assembly, coding, 2D and 3D real-time graphics routines. I was socialized when it comes to programming in the demo scene. So that's where I'm coming from. In 1998, I wanted to do something on this brand new thing, the web, and realize, hey, PHP is a language that allows me to do that. So I started doing that and then quickly fell down the slippery slope of contributing to an open source project, working on the documentation, fixing bugs, working on new features for PHP 5, and started doing open source, obviously, and in 2000 started to work on PHP Unit. Since open source does not put food on the table, and we will come back to that later, I founded a consulting company, together with two friends from the PHP ecosystem, Arne Blankers and Stefan Priebsch, and we've done that in 2009, and that's about as far as ad-related content I'm going to give you today. So I'm talking about the PHP Stacks supply chain, and there are at least two different topics in there. We need to talk about the PHP stack, and we need to talk about supply chain. To make things interesting, we will start with the term supply chain. First time I heard the German term Lieferkette for supply chain was when I was about, I don't know, how old was I? 12, 13 years old, when I played Die Siedler, the Settlers, on my Amiga 500 for the very first time. And you build supply chains in that game. Yeah, you put trees somewhere, those trees grow, and then somebody comes and cuts down the trees. Somebody else makes something useful out of those trees, and so on and so forth. And that is a Lieferkette in a supply chain in the real world, right? And this term over the last couple of years got a lot of attention in the software world, and knowing where basically means knowing where your dependencies come from, but we'll get to that in more detail later on. So this was the Settlers in 1993. One developer worked on that, Volker Wertig. Yeah, and to this day, I stand by the fact that if a new Die Siedler game comes out and Volker Wertig is not involved, then it is not wertig in the German sense of the word, that it's not valuable. So do not play a Die Siedler game if Volker is not involved. And it was written in roughly 70,000 lines of assembly code for the Motorola 68K CPU and the Amiga's graphics and sound coprocessors. And an educated guess is that there were 0 external dependencies in there. He wrote everything he needed for his game by himself, or copy-pasted it from other projects of his and used that, but there was no dependency management that we would think about these days. So what about these days? Fast forward 2023, we're building web applications. And nobody really knows what the term means, or everybody has a different understanding of what the term means. We're all doing full stack. Right? That term had to come up when we have a talk about what is the PHP stacks supply chain. So it gets interesting when we try to answer the question, but what is the full stack? How much stack do I really have? So it starts really simple, right? I just write a PHP application. Do I need more than that? Well, of course I do. Because these days you build your PHP application on top of a framework. You use some third-party libraries on top of the framework or in addition to the framework. You use tools like Composer to manage your runtime dependencies, and you use a tool like 5 to manage your development time dependencies. And you have tools like PHP Unit or Psalm, or PHP Stan, or PHP CS Fixer, or list goes on. All of these things have one thing in common in that they need the PHP runtime to actually run your PHP code. But it doesn't stop there, because the PHP interpreter does not work without without an implementation of the standard C library. And if you want to use XML functionality, you will not get very far, meaning you do not get the DOM extension, the XML reader extension, the XML writer extension, the XSLT extension without another set of third-party libraries that implement this functionality, because it's not the PHP project's job to implement all these kinds of functionalities. It's just a glue from PHP language to something like libxml2 and OpenSSL. Of course, we do not implement our own cryptography. Who in his right mind would do that? There's OpenSSL. So we link against OpenSSL, meaning if you want to use PHP with cryptography, you need OpenSSL. If you want to do regular expressions, you need PCRE, and the list goes on. And unfortunately, it does not stop there, because you cannot compile PHP and you cannot compile OpenSSL or any other of these dependencies without a C compiler or a C++ compiler. And even if you have that, you need a kernel. You need an operating system where you can run that. And this is a really drastic simplification, because an operating system is much more than just the kernel. Yeah, you need a distribution of Linux or whatever your favorite flavor of operating system is. And under that, you have hardware. Because the shiniest operating system with the nicest programming language on top of it does not work without hardware, whatever cloud providers want to tell you. Yeah? At the end, it's some physical machine somewhere running code. And next to your PHP runtime, you have a web server, you have a database server, you have some other components that you use, maybe a Redis, maybe a Memcache, maybe, I don't know, a MongoDB or whatever floats your boat. Right? And it does not stop there, because you can turn this on the head and you have almost the same things in the front end. Yeah, your users are sitting in front of a machine or are holding a machine in their hands, if it's a mobile device. That is hardware. That hardware has an operating system. That operating system runs a browser. Inside the browser, you have a JavaScript engine, and then your front end is developed using a JavaScript framework, and you use some JavaScript libraries, and so on and so forth. And that is the entire stack of involved components. Well, I'm pretty sure that I left some things out, but this is like what I would consider a full stack, like a lower bound for what the full stack is. Yeah, so I do not know about you, but I am not bold enough to claim that I understand every box that I put on the screen right there. I think the last time that I was able to fully understand the combination of hardware and software was when that PCB was a current machine. That's the PCB for my Amiga 1200. At the time, today I no longer understand everything, but back then, when I was still actively using that machine every day, I knew the registers of my CPU. I knew where I needed to do certain things in memory to put a pixel on the screen and things like that. And I knew the operating system inside out and the libraries and so on. But times were a lot simpler back then. And the CPUs of the time, they did not have the problems that we have with our CPUs today. Yeah, like no speculative execution means they were a lot slower, but we also didn't have the risk of Spectre or Meltdown or similar issues. So I'm not the only person who has a problem or a bad feeling about the term full stack. Someone put it much more eloquent than me. I have ranted about the absurdity of the term full stack engineer. I mean, show me the web dev who also writes their own device drivers, but I'd like to recant. Annoying as it may be, but it's a term we've got to describe the most significant shift in engineering roles since DevOps. And a friend of mine who's not here right now, but he's probably upstairs in the PHP room. Of course he's upstairs in the PHP room because his talk is at the same time as mine. So Volker recently said in a conversation with me, what I want to see from people, sure, I mainly do PHP at this company because that's what I was hired for. I mainly identify as a PHP engineer. But if the house is on fire, if there's a serious problem, I'll go fix it. And if I need to learn something new to get that job done, then I will do that. Yeah, I run off and learn what I need to solve the problem or find help along the way. So sorry for getting sidetracked. That was not really about the PHP stack or supply chain, but I just have a bad feeling about the term full stack. So coming back to our stack, if we look at this thing, what could possibly go wrong? Right, there are a lot of moving parts, and there are a lot of people out there with bad intentions, and every box you see here is a potential vector for doing something nasty that you probably do not want to happen to your business, to your software, whatever. So what could possibly go wrong? Well, there could be a hardware bug with security implications. There could be a software bug with security implications. There could be a software feature with security implications, and I cannot stress the difference between the two enough. Yeah, in her presentation earlier today, Bianca Kastel mentioned Log4j, Log4Shell. In my opinion, that was not a software bug. That was a feature working exactly as designed and intended and as tested. Just nobody realized that it would probably be a very bad idea to implement a feature like that. And then you have supply chain attacks. Yeah, attacks on mechanisms, package managers, package distribution, pipelines, the supply chain, the way, the means of getting your dependencies together. And we'll see a couple of examples for that. I have to apologize in advance. I have a couple of examples right now, and that the list of those examples is chronological, and I stopped adding new things to that list about 1.5 years ago. A lot more has happened since then. So the world did not just somehow start to not have these kind of problems anymore. Yeah, so 2014, 9 years ago, Heartbleed happened. Yeah. If your open source project has a security issue and that security issue gets its own logo, you know that you have a problem. Yeah, and the biggest problem about that was that so many people relied on this library while only very few people were actually working on that, and almost nobody got paid for that. So that's how these issues happen. Yeah, then some people think this is really funny. I find these kind of things scary. Yeah, you have an ecosystem like JavaScript with a dependency manager like NPM, and almost everybody relies on this one package. I mean, I do not really understand why you would need a package like that, but that's besides the point. I'm spoiled. I use PHP. PHP comes out of the box with a very good standard library. Other languages don't. So if you need something like string operations, you need to install a package for that. Okay. Different design philosophies, that's perfectly okay. But when you have a package that everyone relies on, and then suddenly the maintainer of that package gets annoyed for whatever reason and deletes the package, a lot of software around the world stops working very suddenly. and that is supply chain. If you as a business rely on that you can install your dependency over and over and over again, and when you suddenly can no longer install that, then you have a problem. Yeah, you have different kinds of problems if people start publishing packages that have a similar name than the one that you're using. Very frequently happens with British versus American English spelling. Yeah, color with OU or just the O. Yeah, then you just register a package and hope that somebody mistypes npm install or in that case pip install whatever, and you get malware, right? Or I could be a very bad person and release a new version of PHP unit and put some malware into PHP unit. And I can guarantee you almost nobody would notice that for long enough to cause a lot of harm. Because I know that on most continuous integration pipeline systems, the tests are run as root, and they run PHP unit, and they run PHP unit with a PHP process that is allowed to do a lot of things, more than it should be allowed to do. And if I put bad code in PHP unit, people would automatically update to that version, and I could own a lot of boxes. Yeah, I'm not going to do that, but I could. Yeah, security issues in CPUs, Meltdown and Spectre. Package managers can have issues. A couple of years ago, 2019, there was a remote code execution in APT, package manager for Debian and Ubuntu-based distributions. Don't ask me why, but apparently pair is still a thing. I would really like to burn it with fire, but we are not there yet. I really hope that nobody is using it anymore, but apparently some people still are. Which is why it was really bad that in 2019 somebody compromised the pair.php.net server and replaced the FAR file, the PHP archive, with the pair installer for installing a pair environment with malware. Not really good. There's a really scary piece of very special package management called firmware update daemon, which updates your CPU's firmware or your BIOS firmware. And the supply chain for that got hacked. And some people were able to publish BIOS updates or CPU microcode updates that did not come from the original hardware vendors. Yeah. This is really annoying. This is the kind of stuff that pisses me off, because these are researchers that tried to sneak bad code into the Linux kernel for research reasons. Thankfully, that was discovered, and thankfully there were consequences for those people, because many publishing houses for academic papers no longer accepted papers from that department, which is like the biggest punishment that you can do in academia. PHP's Git server was compromised in 2021. That's the reason, or that's the kick in the butt we needed as the PHP project to move off our own infrastructure and onto GitHub. Supply chain attacks on Composer happened. Log4Shell happened. This is the funniest one of them all, I think. Somebody bought a new server for their data center, and they are very meticulous about inspecting new hardware they put in their data center. And they looked at the main board, and on the BIOS chip, they saw a sticker that said American Megatrends with an A instead of an E. And they thought, this looks fishy. This is probably not the real BIOS chip that we want on there. Turns out the manufacturer got a bad batch of stickers from American Megatrends that had a typo in them. Don't ask me how that can happen, but the chip was the real one, just the sticker was wrong. I wonder how many people would have caught that if the chip was actually swapped on the way from the factory to the data center. Yeah, when the war on Ukraine started, a lot of wind energy turbines started failing because the supply chain for firmware updates for those turbines got compromised, and via satellite an update was installed that basically stopped the turbines. And lots of other stuff. Another supply chain attack on Pair. GitHub OAuth tokens got stolen, so that is something we need to keep in mind. Yeah, also that can happen. Last year, there was since last year, I have to say, there is a distributed denial of service attack on my open source project PHP unit onto the server or against the server far.phpunit.de, where you can download PHP as a PHP unit as a PHP archive file. The attack is still going on with, I don't know, dozens of terabytes per week, but my server no longer suffers that directly because Cloudflare stepped in and said, hey, PHP unit is critical infrastructure for development and we ourselves use it and we'll make that problem go away for you, which is kind of nice. If I had to pay for that, I would have to pay them several $100s a month to mitigate that attack. I'm very happy that I don't have to pay that. Yeah, and then Heartsbleed and Travis CI has issues. OpenSSL has another issue. Yeah, whatever. You see, and I stopped in July of last year, and since then a lot more attacks like that have happened, which is the reason why over the last couple of years, supply chain has moved into focus. So another disclaimer, I'm not a security expert, I'm not a security person, so I may be considered to be the wrong person to give this kind of talk, but I'm an open source developer, I publish software, people rely on my software, and I have an interest in these kind of issues, although I'm not security focused, as I mentioned. So I hope that everything that I say is correct and good and whatever. I'm giving this presentation in good faith, but there may be some details that I'm missing out or that I'm skipping over. So this is mostly meant as an overview to raise awareness that this is an issue. Yeah, and since this is such a new topic, like in everything that is not software development, supply chain is a topic for, I don't know, decades, right? If you are an airline and you buy a new jet, you get a so-called bill of materials that documents the supply chain for each and every part in that plane, down to the nuts and bolts and screws. Among many reasons, for the reason that if a plane accident happens, and if in the investigation it comes out that this type of screw is responsible for that, everyone can look into their bill of materials. Okay, this plane is safe, it does not have this type of screw. Oh, this plane has this type of screw, but from a different batch that is not affected, so that you can quickly make an informed decision whether or not you need to act on something when something bad happens. For us in the software world, this is rather new. And this is why only recently we got like this model of what different types of categories of supply chain vulnerabilities can be found. And this is just a broad overview. Things can go wrong on the source level, like what we saw happen with the PHP project, that somebody breaks into git.php.net and publishes malicious changes under the names of Rasmus and Nikita. Fortunately, that was quickly discovered. We never tagged the release with those changes. That would have been a disaster. But our code review processes found that. Things can go wrong when software is built, when software is distributed, when software is packaged, when dependencies are resolved and installed, and so on. And I had already learned about many of these things, or heard about them at least, so I had at least some level of awareness that this is an issue that I need to, at some point, really think about. When I came across this article, that this is also something I need to think about when I run a GitHub action. Because somebody can send me a pull request from my project that is then run in my pipeline with access to my credentials that I may have to external services. And they can put something in their pull request that exfiltrates secrets from my GitHub pipeline. Something to think about. If you things that you use in your GitHub actions are also dependencies. And you need to be sure that you can trust those dependencies. Or what's something that Marco experienced, not necessarily related to security, but he ran into weird stability issues with his CI pipelines, and that happened because under the hood suddenly there was a fix in the operating system, and suddenly the PHP was behaving differently and his pipelines were failing. So all of that is part of the supply chain. And then Log4j happened. And a lot of people got a letter and or email that looked like this. Dear provider, I do not know where big corporation thinks that they have a provider relationship with somebody, like in this case an open source project. We use your software and we need to know whether you in your software use Log4j and when you can, if and how you can help us get rid of Log4j if it is in your software, because we use your software and we never told you that we exist, we never paid you because we use a dependency, but we need in the next 24 hours a reply from you because our house is on fire. Thank you very much. Yeah, right? And you can get angry about that, and to some degree you can get angry about that, and you can make fun of that if you want. But I agree with somebody who commented that on the platform that was formerly known as Twitter. I have to tip my hat to big corporation whose software supply chain inventory is comprehensive enough to contact individual open source maintainers. So they had some sort of software supply chain inventory. They knew at least their direct dependencies. They know, hey, we depend on this piece of software. It's open source. We can contact them and ask them if they recursively in their dependencies have Log4j, because we only see that we depend on them, but we do not have the full dependency information. What does that depend on? Because that's depending on how you look at it and in which context you look at it, the nice or scary thing about dependencies, because they are recursive. You depend on something and that something can depend on something else. And that's where the analogy to the real world with the supply chain gets a bit problematic, because we are more talking about in the software world about a graph or a mesh, because everything depends on each other in different versions and so on. So that adds some more problematic dimensions to that. So, and this problems like this have become so mainstream that the government is talking about it, right? And this is there is something called US Executive Order 14028, which was signed by President Biden 2 years ago by now, that basically said, hey, every software that is delivered on the federal level to the US government, starting at that date, needs to have in technical terms, a software bill of material. Yeah, the equivalent to what I mentioned earlier with the JETs, the inventory of materials. Complete reporting on where do the individual parts of the software come from and in what version are they used. Yeah, and this is what such an SBOM can look like, because of course when a problem becomes a problem very suddenly, you get a lot of competing standards. There are, I don't know, at least 5-6 different standards right now in XML or in JSON or in XML and JSON or whatever to describe the contents in terms of supply chain and software bill of materials for a piece of software. And we are getting tools to create those, and we are getting tools to do hopefully useful things with this information. So a while ago, like out of interest and because I got fascinated by that and thought this couldn't be so hard, I implemented an SBOM mechanism for PHP unit. So if you download PHP unit as a PHP archive, you can ask the FAR for its contents. And you get lots of information. In my opinion, this XML standard is too verbose. There's too much information in there. If it were up to me, this would be about the only information that would be in there. Like, hey, I am PHP unit at version 10.3.0, and I belong to this package management ecosystem. I can be installed using Composer, and inside the Composer ecosystem, I am PHP unit / PHP unit. And I use these other components, for instance, my CLab / deep copy at version 1.11.1. There's no point, in my opinion, to put information like group name, description, license information, whatever, into that file. It's into the SBOM for that particular thing. That's information that can be looked up. And most of the things that you do with this information involve lookup. Yeah, you have then tools that look like, okay, this is a package that I can install using Composer. So I can ask packages, is this the latest version? Is this a version that contains known security vulnerabilities and so on? And give a reporting, hey, according to your software bill of materials, you currently have no security issues in your supply chain that you need to worry about. Or maybe you do. Or maybe for license compliance reasons and so on and so forth. There's a lot of useful stuff that you can do with that, if you have it. Yeah, and most or a lot of deployment these days is done using container images and containers, and there's tooling that can give you automatically a software bill of materials in that XML format that I showed you for a Docker container, for instance. Okay, so this is our stack. We talked about that. That looks a lot like this. So if you have never seen that, that is basically all modern digital infrastructure. Of course, it's an XKCD, and there is some random person, maybe in Nebraska, thanklessly maintaining this piece of code somewhere. Yeah, maybe this is the one person that more or less worked full-time on OpenSSL when Heartbleed happened. Maybe this is the person that for decades now works on the time zone database, which almost every piece of software uses to do things with time zones. And a while ago, that person got sued by the vendor of an astrology software because they somehow convinced the patent office that they invented time zones for horoscopes, and you're violating our IP. You are not allowed to publish this time zone database. And this was an open source project that was humming along nicely for decades. No big issues, very low volume mailing list. Everybody was using that, and suddenly they had a problem. A legal problem in that case, not a security issue, and he had to shut down, by order of the court, the website where that project was hosted. Thankfully, the lawyers from Google and Microsoft and others got involved because all of them used that database, and that patent got overthrown, and the project is now back. But that project should never have been just a one-man show, and it's now an official project under the IANA, and things are hopefully better now. Giving a GitHub project stars as a thank you is the thoughts and prayers of open source. If you really want to support an open source developer, then give them money. Stars don't put full food on the table. That's a quote from Larry Garfield, someone from the PHP community that he made quite a while ago. And if I remember correctly, when I first read that, I did not really understand what he was talking about, because I started to do, or I got involved in open source because it felt right for the kind of things that I wanted to do. It just felt right to publish something like PHP Unit as open source. It just felt right when I was using when I started to use PHP. I realized, oh, this is open source. If I have a problem, I can contribute to that, and so on. And that always felt right, but I never made those contributions to other projects, and I also did not start my own open source projects with a financial motivation. I did never, and to this day, I do not expect to get paid for what I do, because I do it of free will. Nobody is forcing me to do that. When I get angry about some things related to open source, then it's because people suddenly start demanding things from me. Yeah, I do something as open source, everybody can use it, and then they start using it, and then they said, yeah, you are stupid, calling me names or demanding things. Like one of the most ridiculous interactions I ever had with, I woke up one morning, looked into my emails, got an issue, reported on my open source project like 12 hours before, when I got to bed. And overnight, lots of comments on that. Hey, why is this not fixed? Is this what you call support? This requires your immediate attention. Why are you not fixing this? And at the end, it turned out the person did not understand that they were not talking to a regular vendor that they are paying, but to a volunteer whose work they're using. And they later apologized, but they just did not know what open source is about and how it works. So why do I do that? And that's a question that I get a lot. And I've been doing that for over 2 decades now. And according to some people, I should have stopped doing that a long time ago, because sometimes I get angry, sometimes I'm disappointed, and so on. For instance, because of parasitic corporations that exploit open source without giving back. Quoting some people, open source was the attempt to turn the free software movement into unpaid labor for capital. So when I got started in open source, I only knew about open source, and only later I found out about free software. And that's like everything in life. Nothing is ever fully not political in nature. So I agree with a lot of things that have to do with free software versus open source. But it's the term that I learned first, which is why I mostly use open source. But I do know and do realize and do appreciate that there's a fine difference with free software being more political than just open source. Yeah, things like this happen. This is a quote from Dan Aykroyd, also a PHP contributor. Yeah, beneficiary of open source is incredibly keen on open source continuing to provide them with huge benefits, and will pay for marketing for that, but not so much actually sponsoring developers. That was an incident, I think 1 or 2 years ago, when one of the big tech companies put a lot of money into marketing, finding new developers that maintain the open source project that the company uses, instead of going to people working on that open source project and paying them to do what they are already doing. Because for them, this is mostly about marketing and not about doing something like giving back to the community or whatever. Yeah, Fortune 500 companies would very much like there to be an expectation that open source projects must do extra work for managing a community, so that there are backup maintainers waiting to get over. And from the perspective of a corporation, that at least at first glance is at least a bit understandable. I'm a business, I need to run a business. There's a component over there that I chose to use to build my software that runs my business. Of course, I have an interest that that keeps working. And one way of doing that would be to contribute back to that, like time and features and work on the software, or give money to people that do that. Or I could just apply pressure here and there and hope that the project will be around. Yeah, somebody else put it like this: being a company and installing dependencies from public free package indexes is like going to the library every day and checking out 50 books that are necessary to run your business. Getting mad when the library gives you the wrong book is not so nice of the library. That is blaming the wrong organization, the wrong point. And I already mentioned earlier that the government is getting involved. I also remember reading 5, 6, 7 years ago, maybe even more, an article by Robert C. Martin where he said, hey, we, the software engineering profession, we do not have a code of ethics yet, something that medicine had, that other industry disciplines have. But we as software developers do not have that, and we need to change that. Otherwise, at some point, the government will start to tell us how we do our work. And I can guarantee you one thing: this will not be very useful guidelines for us. Yeah? If we had a code of ethics like that, maybe something like the issue at Volkswagen would not have happened, because the engineers would have said, no, we will not implement these requirements. But you never know. Fact is, we do not have a code of ethics like that. We still don't, and that's the problem. And when it comes to security issues and software supply chain, governments around the world are starting to tell software developers how they should work. And not all of that is in the interest of open source, at least. So this is a bill that was entered into the US Congress last year, if I remember correctly. Yeah, September 22. And the comments on that are not very great. Yeah, here's one comment: this is likely going to create a real demand on open source maintainers to step it up with regards to security. So it puts a lot of burden on open source software developers, as if open source developers had not enough burdens already. Do more for security so that companies must do less, because they can say, I use this open source library and they need to do, by law, put these security measures in place, so I can rely on that. I do not need to pay for that. Yeah, but there's no provision in there how to help open source maintainers with that burden. I never imagined that I would ever quote Ronald Reagan, but he once said, the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Yeah? We, as the open source community, probably do not want this kind of help that is maybe well-intentioned, but in practice turns out to be problematic. And I mentioned earlier, it's all around the world that things are like that are happening. It's not just in the US, triggered by this Senate bill in the US, to some degree at least. We are now talking about the EU Cyber Resilience Act over here in Europe. Yeah, and if that is implemented as it's currently written, it will have a chilling effect on open source software development as a global endeavor, with the net effect of undermining the European Union's own expressed goals for innovation, digital sovereignty, and future prosperity. That's quoting from a statement of the Eclipse Foundation in response to the Cyber Resilience Act. And you can read similar statements from the FSFE, from other open source organizations and foundations, and from corporations even, like GitHub and Microsoft and others. Yeah, another reason why I should have stopped doing that open source work a long time ago is because of toxic users. Not going into details here. Jordi, the maintainer, one of the maintainers of Composer, wrote an article last year where he said what feels like a lifetime of maintaining open source projects has left me with some things to say about the haters. I'm not sure why. Trying to do a light take of it instead of getting mad. Here's a post categorizing them. And like everything he writes in there is true. I've heard many bad stories from other open source maintainers. I know a couple of things that have happened to me. For instance, this distributed denial of service attack on my project's infrastructure alongside emails and issues on GitHub that I had to report and delete, and threats on my life, threats with violence and whatever. Let's not talk about those nasty details. Basically, the attack is still going on, but it's behind Cloudflare now, so I don't have to care about it every day anymore, so that's good. But that things like that happen is not nice. And I still do that because I fundamentally believe that infrastructure such as operating systems, programming languages, development tools like PHP Unit, for instance, must be open source. Everything else feels wrong to me. And this is why I still do that. This is why I engage in my spare time and help the PHP Foundation, which is why I get involved in a working group inside the German Academic Society for Computer Science, because, surprise, they do not know a lot about open source yet. And we are a couple of people like me from outside of academia and some people from within the academia to change that and distribute some knowledge about open source inside the academic world, because I think those are the right things to do. But that's volunteer work, but I still think that this is important to do, and that is why I continue to do that. And with that, thank you for coming to this presentation. Thank you for your interest in the PHP stack and in supply chains. And my goal with this talk was to raise awareness that this thing of supply chain exists in the software world. It may be a little bit different than supply chains in the real world, but the core concept still applies. And we need to be aware of the dependencies of our dependencies that we use. So otherwise, it will be really, really, really hard to quickly and reliably answer questions like, am I affected by this vulnerability in that dependency? Do I have that dependency? Yes or no? Do I have it in the affected version? Yes or no? What can I do about that? We need to raise that awareness, and I'm not entirely sure that all the legal and law-related things that are now put into effect will really help with that. Maybe they will get even in the way. I don't know. I'm not an expert in that. I'm not a lawyer. But I have a fear that not all of that will be for the better. But hopefully things turn out better than I assume. So, thank you.
We have about 10 minutes left if anyone wants to ask questions.
Any questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. So let me repeat the question quickly. So the question was, I raised a lot of problems, and what are my recommendations for dealing with these problems? Are there some things that can be done apart from hoping for a better world? I think the first step has to be awareness. You need to be aware that Your software is not just your software. You are responsible for everything that you ship, and that includes any third-party dependencies that you have. And you must know what those third-party dependencies are. I still, like I mentioned earlier, like I quoted Larry earlier, GitHub stars don't put food on the table, so I have to do other work than open source work to put food on my table, and I work as a consultant. Yeah, I help teams build better software with PHP. And it scares me every time I see it that even today, 2023, some teams are not managing their dependencies in a consistent way. Yeah. Rather new software that was started in the last 5 to 10 years maybe has a high chance of consistently using Composer and the packages ecosystem, for instance. Then, at least where PHP is concerned, it's really easy to figure out what your dependencies are because you look at the output of Composer info. And then you see all your dependencies that are installed directly or indirectly. But I still see frequently, and as recent as a couple of months ago, applications that, yes, they started their life maybe 15 years ago or maybe even older, but they still manage their dependencies manually. Yeah, dependencies downloaded manually from the internet, put somewhere into my application directory, checked into version control, and nobody knows where all the dependencies are in the project and what versions they are. And in a situation like that, you are blind. When there's a security announcement for component X in version ABC, you do not know whether you are affected by that. And the first thing, like the minimal first thing that you need to do is consistently use dependency management. This I know this sounds like a trivial thing because everybody should be doing this for a gazillion of other reasons already, but now you can add security to that list as well. And I'm convinced that sooner or later we will get regulation for how software is developed. Not initially, maybe only for software that is developed for the government, but the private sector will sooner or later follow. And then you need to be aware of what you're doing, what you're shipping, and hopefully those regulations are useful and do not get in the way. Yeah. You mentioned that you had a second question. Mm-hmm. Before I repeat the question, I'm not so sure where I said that the government was evil. I do not. Yeah. You put it in air quotes. Okay, so I get that. So I do not fear that the government will put any regulation in place with bad intentions. I totally believe that they're doing everything that they do in this regard is well intentioned. I just don't think, or I just fear that because they are not subject matter experts, they do not know how software development works. Much less that I know how creating a law works. Yeah, both of them are called code somehow. No? We have a code of law and we have code. And there are some, on a metaphorical level, some similarities. Yeah, I once read a nice article saying our laws are the operating system of our society, and there is some truth to that. And I totally agree, we can influence that. And I tried to influence that, like with the EU Cyber Resilience Act. I wrote a letter to all EU Parliament representatives, members of EU Parliament that are responsible for the state of Germany where I live in, which is this one. So there is not like, it's not like with the German Parliament where there's one member of Parliament that is elected by my area, but for this big area it's 16, 17 people. I wrote to all of them. Most of them did not reply. Those that did reply replied in one of two ways. That is not my topic, and I do not care about that topic. I trust that my colleagues that know more about this than I do will do the right thing. Or they replied, I think the problems that you see do not exist, but I also do not know the details, but I trust that everything is right. So, yes, we can do something, but as long as we do not get more people involved that actually understand the subject matter, then we probably, I don't know. Maybe more software developers need to go into politics. I don't know. Maybe that's the solution. But if that is a solution, then it is a very long-term solution, because you will not get into parliament overnight. And probably also not within the next 5 years or so. I'm sorry when I sound very pessimistic and only talk about problems without offering any solutions. But that's part of the reason why I give this talk, because this is a topic that I feel is important, and I want to raise awareness for that. And so far, I mostly only have questions. I do not have any answers yet. But we need to raise awareness for that, so that maybe somebody comes along, hey, I have a solution for that. Let's try this. That's what I'm hoping for. No more questions. Everybody is tired. It's the end of the day. Okay. That's fine, I guess. Thank you.